In this video, I want to talk about what it means to have a small audience in sponsorship, why it's actually a superpower, and how I made the most sponsorship revenue in my career through audiences of 100 to 150 people. We're going to cover that and how you can take advantage of having a so-called small audience to bring in more sponsors. Check it out. I have no doubt, if you're watching this video, that you have said, I'm struggling to get sponsorship because I have a small audience. Every time I hear this, I ask the question, well, what do you mean by small audience? And I hear people say anything from 1,000 people to 50,000 people to 100,000 people. I've heard every audience size described as a so-called small audience. The reason people are calling this a small audience is because they're just finding someone or some property that's bigger than theirs and comparing themselves to it. Well, yes, compared to audiences that are bigger than yours, your audience is small. But that doesn't mean your audience is unattractive to sponsors. I have worked on multi-million-dollar sponsorship properties, sponsorship opportunities with hundreds of thousands of people and hundreds of people. Both properties brought in multiple $1-million sponsorship deals. Radically different size. The size of your audience is not the most important thing. In fact, I would go so far as to say that believing your audience is too small is buying into a myth, an incorrect myth, a damaging myth that's holding you back. There was a period of time where I was personally selling $80,000 to $150,000 individual sponsorship deals for an audience of approximately 150 people. We sold dozens of these sponsorship opportunities. I think by any measure, 150 people would be considered a small audience to the wrong sponsor. And I would argue that if you think your audience is too small, you are just focused on the wrong details of your audience and the wrong sponsors. When we ran our conference a few years ago, we had an audience of 350 people. It's a reasonable size for a first-year conference, but nowhere near the size of most mega conferences. And yet we beat them for total sponsorship revenue, hands down. How did we do that? Because we knew who our audience was and which sponsors would be interested in that audience. In fact, it's actually significantly easier to get sponsors for smaller audiences. It's much easier to get detailed information about smaller audiences. It's easier to survey them. And if you can't survey them, you can just put together a focus group because your audience is small. It's also easier to know exactly what your audience wants and to create an experience that they enjoy. These are all things that large properties with large audiences struggle with. When you have a so-called small audience, you actually are missing one of the biggest drawbacks of a large audience. And the reason for that is the riches are in the niches. The more you can niche down or niche down into your audience to understand who they are and what they want, the more targeted your prospecting can be. In fact, one of the things that we teach our clients to do when they have large audiences is to break their audience down into multiple niche audiences. In other words, we teach large properties to act like small properties. So it's always shocking to me when I hear so-called small properties with small audiences show up and say, oh, I don't get sponsorship because our audience isn't big enough. Yet the way we help our clients bring in major sponsorship deals is by having them emulate the small shop, the small micro audience. The more narrow and niched down you can get into your audience, the higher your value and the easier it is to sell to sponsors. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most people who think their audience is too small and that's why they're not doing well in sponsorship are actually using old school, outdated techniques where you send sponsorship packages to strangers full of gold, silver, bronze, and vanity metrics, and you're being ignored by sponsors. Not because your audience is too small, but because you're not practicing sponsorship well. If you are practicing sponsorship perfectly and identifying your audience and connecting with sponsors using a discovery-based, negotiation-based approach, I'm willing to bet that you will find small audiences do significantly better than large audiences, because size of audience is actually the least interesting quality of your sponsorship opportunity. Unless you've convinced yourself that this myth is true, because you don't want to look at the real reason for your sponsorship opportunity not succeeding. And that's because you're not using best practice. Thinking my audience is too small, that's why I'm not getting any sponsorship, is the wrong approach. The right approach is to ask, who is my audience valuable to? Which brands, which companies are trying to sell products to this audience? If Mercedes happens to be interested in your 150 people because they represent the exact target audience that Mercedes is interested in, you don't have a small audience. You have an opportunity to sell hundreds or thousands of vehicles, which means you have a multi-million dollar pipeline for a car company who is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every month to get in front of the exact audience you've curated. Most car lots would pay a lot of money to get 150 people to show up on their lot and go on a test drive. But if you have no idea who your audience is or who is valuing your audience as a customer, i.e., you don't have good audience data, it doesn't matter how big your audience is, you won't be successful. If you have a smaller audience, I think you should forget about consumer products. If you go after a company that sells coffee and the average unit price is $2, then 150 people who might buy a $2 coffee is not particularly interesting to consumer brands. But if you have 150 people who plan to buy a new house, or who are business owners who plan to hire new legal counsel or build a new website or switch their CRMs, you've got a multi-million-dollar opportunity for a sponsor. Focusing on low-ticket, low-cost consumer products when your audience is less than a couple thousand people, you're really not offering a sponsor much. The other thing I would say is that you need to forget about vanity assets if you have a smaller audience. If your audience is just a couple hundred people showing up at a conference, you've got an outstanding sponsorship opportunity, but not if you're trying to value sponsorship by how many people see a logo on a sign at registration. A logo on a sign at registration at best is worth 3 cents per view. You need a lot of people to make a vanity metric that is low value worth anything. And this goes back to my greater point, which is our clients, when they come to us with large audiences, we tell them to think like a small property with a small audience, create amazing experiences for audience niches, audience segments, rather than slapping logos on everything. The small audience needs to forget about vanity metrics and instead focus on creating amazing experiences. I mentioned my conference early on, 350 people. We did incredibly well for sponsorship. Did we do that by putting logos on stuff? Absolutely not. Sure, we put logos on things. It's just nobody cares about that. We created amazing experiences tied directly to the brand's goals and what we knew our audience wanted more of. And that's how we were able to seriously monetize just a couple hundred people. But if we focused on vanity metrics, I would be sitting there with you complaining that I can't do sponsorship because my audience is too small. And ultimately, it just comes down to the math. If something is super low value, like a logo on a sign multiplied by 300 people, you're not going to make any money. But if a company is willing to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars for, say, a test drive or a high-ticket product sampling, if they're willing to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars for that, which they are if they're engaged in marketing, multiply that by 300, and you've got yourself a reasonable sponsorship opportunity. Layer on the very high value opportunities like speaking from the stage or targeted networking opportunities or lead generation. Now you've got yourself a really attractive sponsorship opportunity. And as it turns out, those are exactly the kind of assets and benefits that I've used when monetizing smaller audiences, and how we are able to do multiple 6 and 7-figure deals with audiences of just a couple hundred people. We know what brands are interested in them. We know exactly what our audiences want, and we don't focus on vanity metrics that are not really worth anything. Experience matters. Engagement is key. If you don't provide high value, high touch engagement opportunities between sponsors and audience, you are not going to do well. And it doesn't matter how big your audience is. 40,000 people looking at a logo, you're going to struggle to find brands who want to sponsor your opportunity. 150 ideal customers taking the exact step that future customers take right before they make a purchase, sponsors are willing to pay a lot more money for that. In other words, it doesn't actually matter how big your audience is. Nothing changes in terms of how you do sponsorship. You have to have a good, deep, thorough understanding of who your audience is and what they want. Use that to prospect and to determine what sponsors you should be talking to. Create amazing, high leverage sponsorship activations rather than logo soup and boring vanity metrics. Provide a reliable valuation that measures return on investment for the sponsor. Do what you say, provide a fulfillment report, and over deliver. If you're not doing what I just described, the problem is not your audience size. It's your approach to sponsorship. And if any sales material that leaves your office has the word gold, silver, or bronze on it, I can tell you right now, you have discovered a sponsor repellent. It has nothing to do with your audience and everything to do with your approach. I would love it if down below in the comments you would share your biggest takeaway, the number one thing that you're going to change about how you're looking for sponsorship. And if you like this video, it would mean a lot to me if you just hit the thumbs up button and the subscribe button so that you never miss another video. And remember, the sponsorship proposal does not make the sale. You do. Good luck out there.